Montana Territory, December 1889. The wind cut through the Bitterroot Valley like a blade. Temperatures had already dropped to 15 below zero, and the real winter hadn't even begun. In a clearing 3 miles west of what would later become Missoula, a Norwegian immigrant was finishing something his neighbors called the stupidest cabin ever built. Lars Eriksson had spent the entire autumn constructing what appeared to be 2 cabins, one inside the other. A full 8-foot gap separated the inner walls from the outer walls. Neighbors rode past and shook their heads. Wasting good timber, they muttered. Building 2 cabins when one would do. Some called it madness. Others called it worse. But Lars just smiled and kept working. What did this Norwegian homesteader understand about surviving deadly cold that experienced Montana builders had missed? The answer would reveal itself in less than 6 weeks, and it would change how people thought about frontier shelter forever. Before we go further, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand a survival principle so powerful that modern engineers are rediscovering it 130 years later. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how cold it gets where you are. Now, let's go back to that autumn of 1889, when a community was about to learn a lesson in physics they'd never forget. Lars Eriksson arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1888, one of thousands of Scandinavian immigrants drawn by the Homestead Act's promise of free land. He was 34 years old, built like an ox, and spoke English with an accent so thick his neighbors often pretended not to understand him. But Lars didn't need English to communicate his intentions. He had his hands, his back, and a memory of Norwegian winters that made Montana look almost mild. By his second autumn, Lars had proven himself a capable farmer and a tireless worker. His wheat crop had come in strong. His root cellar was properly dug. He'd earned the grudging respect of his neighbors, until he started building his cabin. The problems began in late August when Lars began felling trees for his home. He marked and cut 240 logs, nearly double what a standard 16 by 20-foot cabin required. His nearest neighbor, a grizzled homesteader named Dutch Henry, rode over to see what the Norwegian was planning. "You building 2 cabins?" Dutch Henry asked, eyeing the massive pile of logs. "1 cabin," Lars replied in his thick accent. "But different." "Different how?" Lars tried to explain, mixing broken English with hand gestures, but Dutch Henry just shook his head and rode off, convinced the Norwegian had miscalculated his lumber needs. Within days, the story spread through the valley. That fool Norwegian doesn't know how to count logs. By September, when Lars began actual construction, the mockery intensified. He started with a standard log cabin foundation, but then, instead of building the walls directly on it, he constructed an inner framework first. This inner cabin measured 12 by 16 feet, with walls of tightly chinked logs standing 7 feet tall. Then came the part that made people laugh out loud. Lars built a second set of walls, complete outer walls, exactly 8 feet away from his inner walls on all 4 sides. The outer cabin measured 28 by 32 feet, creating a continuous 8-foot gap that ran around the entire inner structure like a moat made of air. "He's building a cabin inside a barn," someone joked at the general store. "Wasting 8 feet on every side," Dutch Henry told anyone who'd listen. "That's 512 square feet of nothing. Could have had a cabin twice the size for the same logs." An experienced builder named Thomas Bradley rode out specifically to see this architectural oddity. Bradley had constructed over 40 cabins in Montana and Wyoming. He took one look at Lars's double wall design and shook his head in disbelief. "Son," Bradley said, speaking slowly as if to a child, "I don't know how you folks build in Norway, but out here, we don't waste space heating empty air. You're going to burn twice the wood trying to warm that outer gap, and your inner cabin will still freeze." Lars just nodded politely and continued working. He'd heard it all before, in Norwegian, from people who'd never survived a Lofoten winter. What Lars understood, and what his critics didn't, was a principle of thermal physics that wouldn't be formally articulated in building science for another 50 years. The concept of thermal bridging and insulation through dead air space. In the mountains of northern Norway, Lars had grown up in homes that used a technique called Tommerveger med luftrom, timber walls with air chambers. His grandfather had explained it simply. Cold doesn't just push through walls. It runs along every solid connection between outside and inside. Break those connections, and you break the cold's path. The inner cabin Lars built was designed as a sealed thermal envelope. He chinked every gap between logs with a mixture of clay, moss, and straw until not a whisper draft could penetrate. The door was thick pine with a wool blanket hung inside for an additional barrier. One small window faced south, its shutters designed to seal tight at night. This inner cabin was where Lars would actually live, sleep, cook, and spend his winter. It measured just 192 square feet, small enough that his body heat and a modest fire could warm it efficiently. But the genius lay in what surrounded it. The outer cabin created an 8-foot buffer zone on all four sides, a total gap of 4,096 cubic feet of trapped air between the inner living space and the brutal Montana winter. Lars didn't heat this buffer zone. He didn't need to. The air itself, trapped and still, would act as insulation. Dead air is one of nature's finest insulators. Modern building science confirms this. Still air has a thermal resistance, R value, of approximately 1.0 per inch. Lars's 8-foot gap, 96 inches, created an insulation value exceeding R90, comparable to modern super-insulated homes. But in 1889 Montana, nobody understood R values. They just understood that Lars Ericsson was building something that made no sense. Thomas Bradley wasn't the only critic. A man named James Woolworth, who ran a sawmill in Missoula, heard about the double cabin and rode out with 2 of his mill hands to see it firsthand. Woolworth considered himself an authority on timber and construction. He walked around Lars's structure, measuring the gaps, counting the logs used, calculating the wasted space. "This is the work of a man who doesn't understand American building," Woolworth announced to his companions. "In the old country, maybe they have lumber to waste. Here, efficiency matters." He's built himself a prison inside a barn. When Woolworth confronted Lars directly, the Norwegian tried to explain, "The outer cabin, it does not need heat. The air between is like—" He struggled for the English word, finally settling on blanket. "Blanket," Woolworth laughed. "Son, blankets are made of wool, not air. Air moves. It can't insulate anything." But Lars knew better. Air only moves when it can flow. Trapped air, dead air, remains still. And still air is perhaps the most elegant insulator the natural world provides. What Lars had created wasn't a cabin inside a barn. It was a thermal flask designed for human survival, a principle that Scandinavian builders had refined over centuries of Arctic winters, now transplanted to the Montana wilderness where it was desperately needed but utterly misunderstood. The construction details of Lars's double cabin revealed a mind that thought in 3 dimensions about heat, cold, and survival. Every element served multiple purposes, and nothing was wasted despite his neighbor's accusations. The outer cabin walls stood 9 feet tall, constructed from 10-inch diameter lodgepole pine logs. Lars deliberately left the chinking loose in several places, not out of carelessness, but by design. These intentional gaps would allow moisture to escape from the buffer zone while preventing wholesale air exchange. The outer structure didn't need to be airtight. It needed to be a wind barrier and a moisture shield. The roof system demonstrated even more sophistication. Lars created 2 separate roofs with a 14-inch gap between them. The inner roof consisted of split shakes laid over closely spaced rafters, sealed with tar and moss. The outer roof was built with rougher shakes, deliberately spaced to allow air circulation in the attic gap. This prevented condensation buildup, a killer in cold climates, where frozen condensation can destroy insulation value and rot wood. The inner cabin, by contrast, was built like a ship, airtight, compact, efficient. The log walls were smaller diameter, 8 inches, but chinked so thoroughly that Lars used 3 barrels of clay mixture on just 192 square feet of wall space. The door was double-layered, an inner plank door that opened into the living space, and an outer door that opened into the buffer zone, creating an airlock effect. One detail particularly baffled observers. Lars built no windows in the north, east, or west walls of his inner cabin. Only one window faced south, and even that was small, just 18 by 24 inches, with heavy shutters that closed from inside. Thomas Bradley pointed this out as proof of Lars's ignorance. Man needs light, Bradley argued. He's built himself a cave. Come February, he'll be half mad from sitting in the dark. But Lars had calculated precisely. That single south-facing window would capture whatever winter sunlight Montana offered, while minimizing heat loss through glass, the weakest point in any thermal envelope. On cloudy days, he'd use candles and lanterns. The trade-off was acceptable: comfort over convenience, warmth over light. The floor system revealed even more forethought. Between the outer cabin's foundation and the inner cabin's floor, Lars had created a crawl space filled with dry sand and gravel, 18 inches of mineral insulation that would prevent ground cold from wicking upward. The inner cabin's floor sat on short posts, allowing air circulation underneath, while keeping the living surface elevated and dry. Dutch Henry rode past one afternoon in mid-October and found Lars working on the gap between the cabins. The Norwegian was stacking cut logs in the 8-foot buffer zone, not randomly, but in organized rows with air spaces between them. Now you're using your buffer space for wood storage? Dutch Henry called out, thinking he'd caught Lars in an admission that the space was useless otherwise. Yes, Lars replied simply. Wood stays dry. Air still does not move. Both things are good. Dutch Henry shook his head and rode off. Another story to tell at the general store. The fool Norwegian is now storing firewood in the middle of his wasted space. Might as well have built a normal cabin with a proper wood shed. What Dutch Henry didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Lars was creating a layered defense system against cold. The firewood itself added thermal mass and further broke up air convection currents in the buffer zone. It was storage, yes, but it was also functional insulation. By the time Lars finished construction in late November, he'd used 240 logs, 3 barrels of chinking clay, 180 pounds of moss for wagon loads of sand, and countless hours of careful, methodical work. The structure looked bizarre, a massive outer shell containing a cozy inner core, with a mysterious gap between them that seemed to serve no purpose. His neighbors' cabins, by contrast, were models of frontier efficiency, single-wall construction, tightly built, with large stone fireplaces or cast-iron stoves positioned centrally. These were the proven designs that had served settlers for generations. Dutch Henry's cabin measured 18 by 24 feet, larger than Lars's inner cabin, with solid construction and a fireplace that could burn 4-foot logs. Winter will teach him, James Woolworth predicted. He'll be burning wood day and night, trying to heat all that empty space, while the rest of us stay warm with half the effort. The first snows came in early December. Temperatures dropped into the teens at night. Lars moved into his inner cabin, lighting his modest corner fireplace for the first time. His neighbors watched the smoke from his chimney and waited for him to admit his mistake. They would be waiting a long time. December passed cold but manageable. January began the same way, temperatures dropping to 0 at night, rising to the teens during the day. Standard Montana winter, nothing the old-timers hadn't seen before. But on January 8, 1890, the weather changed. A high-pressure system descended from Canada, bringing with it the kind of cold that killed livestock and tested every aspect of frontier construction. By January 10th, thermometers at the Missoula General Store registered 22 below zero. By the morning of January 12th, the mercury had dropped to 38 below. It was the kind of cold that made trees explode with rifle crack sounds as sap froze and expanded. The kind of cold where breath crystallized instantly and fell to the ground like snow. The kind of cold where exposed skin froze in under 3 minutes. Dutch Henry's cabin, like most in the valley, was built around a large central fireplace made of river stone. On the morning of January 12th, Dutch Henry woke at 4 a.m., earlier than usual, because despite the fire that had burned all night, his cabin had grown unbearably cold. He stumbled from his bed, breath visible even indoors, and checked the fireplace. The coals were still glowing, but the heat seemed to vanish before it could spread. He loaded the firebox with 4 large logs, twice his normal load, and climbed back under every blanket he owned. By 6 a.m., with dawn breaking cold and clear, the thermometer nailed to his north wall read 23 degrees Fahrenheit inside the cabin. Outside, it was 38 below zero, a difference of 61 degrees, and Dutch Henry was burning wood as fast as he could split it. Thomas Bradley fared slightly better. His cabin had a smaller footprint and thicker walls, plus a cast-iron stove he'd hauled from back east. But even with the stove glowing red-hot and consuming wood at an alarming rate, his interior thermometer struggled to reach 30 degrees. The stone foundation was wicking cold up through the floorboards. Frost formed on the interior walls wherever his breath hit them. He hung blankets over the windows and wore his coat indoors. James Woolworth, the sawmill man, gave up trying to sleep in his cabin entirely. On the night of January 11th, he moved into his barn with his 2 horses, reasoning that their body heat would at least keep the temperature above freezing. He was right, barely. The barn hovered around 34 degrees, just warm enough to prevent water from freezing solid, just cold enough to make sleep nearly impossible. Across the valley, people hunkered down and fed their fires. A homesteader named Carl Peterson burned his spare furniture to supplement his dwindling wood supply. Martha Quinn and her 2 children all slept in the same bed, piled under every piece of fabric they owned. The cold wave wasn't just uncomfortable, it was legitimately dangerous, which is why, on the morning of January 12th, Dutch Henry decided to ride over and check on that fool Norwegian. He bundled himself in every layer he could fit under his coat, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes showed, and rode the 3 miles to Lars's property. He half expected to find the Norwegian frozen in his ridiculous double cabin, or perhaps huddled in the outer structure trying to heat that massive, useless space. What he found instead changed everything he thought he knew about surviving winter. Smoke was rising lazily from Lars's chimney. Not the thick, constant stream that poured from every other chimney in the valley, but a thin, intermittent trickle. Dutch Henry dismounted, tied his horse to the hitching post, and approached the outer cabin door. It opened easily. Lars never locked it. The buffer zone was cold, perhaps 10 or 15 degrees, but it was still. No wind. The stacked firewood along the walls had a thin coating of frost, but was otherwise dry and accessible. Dutch Henry crossed the 8-foot gap and knocked on the inner cabin door. "Come." Lars's voice called from inside. Dutch Henry opened the door and was hit by a wall of warmth that made him gasp. He stepped inside quickly, shutting the door behind him, and stood blinking in the sudden heat. Lars was sitting at a small table, eating breakfast in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no hat. The thermometer hanging on the south wall read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees. Dutch Henry looked at the thermometer, then at Lars, then at the small corner fireplace where a modest fire burned, nothing like the roaring blazes everyone else was maintaining. "How?" Dutch Henry finally managed. "How is it this warm?" Lars smiled and gestured around the small interior. "The outer cabin, it holds the cold far away. The air between, it does not move. No wind touches these walls. The little fire, it is only this small space to warm. The heat, it stays." Dutch Henry stood in the middle of that 192-square-foot space and realized he'd been wrong about everything. While his own cabin, larger, more traditionally built, with a massive fireplace consuming half a cord of wood every 24 hours, struggled to maintain 23 degrees. Lars was comfortable at 68 degrees with a fire that looked barely large enough to cook on. The math was devastating. Lars's inner cabin was 38 degrees warmer than the outside air, a 76-degree difference. Dutch Henry's cabin was only 61 degrees above the outside temperature, despite burning 2 or 3 times as much wood. But even more remarkable, Lars was maintaining his comfortable 68 degrees, with perhaps 1/4 the wood Dutch Henry was consuming. The small corner fireplace didn't need massive logs. 6 to 8 pieces of split wood, properly placed, would burn for 6 to 8 hours and keep the tight thermal envelope perfectly warm. Before we continue, and trust me, the numbers get even more impressive, Hit that like button if this is blowing your mind. Subscribe because we're about to break down exactly how this works, and I guarantee it'll change how you think about heating. Drop a comment below. What's the coldest temperature you've ever experienced? Word spread faster than the cold front had arrived. By the afternoon of January 12th, Thomas Bradley had ridden over to see for himself. By evening, James Woolworth had joined them. Within 3 days, nearly every homesteader within 15 miles had made the pilgrimage to Lars Eriksson's double cabin to stand inside that impossibly warm inner room and try to understand what they were witnessing. Lars, to his credit, welcomed everyone. He showed them the construction details, explained his reasoning in his broken English, and let them verify his thermometer against their own. The measurements were consistent and undeniable. On January 14th, 1890, with outside temperatures at 41 below zero, Lars's inner cabin maintained 67 degrees Fahrenheit, a differential of 108 degrees, while consuming approximately 6 pieces of split firewood every 6 hours. That worked out to roughly 24 pieces per 24-hour period. Thomas Bradley, by comparison, was burning 50 to 60 pieces of similar-sized wood in the same time frame just to keep his larger cabin at a barely tolerable 28 degrees. He was using more than twice the wood to achieve less than half the warmth. Dutch Henry kept detailed records for 7 consecutive days during the cold snap. His findings, written in a journal that would later be preserved in the Missoula County Historical Society, laid out the comparison starkly. January 12th to 18th, 1890, temperature comparison average outside temperature, minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit, Dutch Henry's cabin. Interior average 26 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumed, 312 pieces, Thomas Bradley's cabin. Interior average 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumed, 368 pieces, Lars Eriksson's inner cabin. Interior average 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumed, 144 pieces. Lars was maintaining a temperature 40 degrees warmer than his nearest competitor while using less than half the wood. In frontier terms, where every piece of firewood represented hours of labor, cutting, splitting, stacking, carrying, this wasn't just impressive. It was revolutionary. The physics behind the performance became clearer as people examined the system more carefully. The 8-foot buffer zone around Lars's inner cabin was maintaining a temperature of roughly 20 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside air was 35 or 40 below. That 15 to 20 degree difference in the buffer zone meant Lars's inner walls were only fighting against a 46 degree differential, not the 105 degree differential that his neighbors faced. Thermal bridging, the phenomenon where cold travels along solid connections, was virtually eliminated. In traditional single-wall cabins, every log that ran from outside to inside became a pathway for cold to conduct inward. In Lars's design, there were no solid connections between the outer shell and the inner living space except for the roof supports, which he had deliberately wrapped with moss and straw insulation. The inner cabin's small volume was another key factor. With only 192 square feet of floor space and perhaps 1,300 cubic feet of total volume, a small fire could warm the entire space efficiently. Heat wasn't lost traveling through large rooms or rising to high ceilings. It was concentrated exactly where Lars needed it. The thermal mass of the inner cabin's tightly chinked logs also worked in his favor. Once warmed, those logs retained heat for hours, radiating it back into the living space even as the fire burned low. The entire structure functioned like a massive heat battery, charging during the day and discharging slowly through the night. But perhaps the most impressive detail emerged from Martha Quinn, who had brought her husband over to see the cabin. Martha was a practical woman with 7 Montana winters behind her, and she asked the question that revealed the system's true brilliance. What happens when you let the fire go out? Lars smiled. I show you. On the morning of January 16th, with temperatures still hovering around 30 below, Lars let his fire burn down to ash at 6 a.m. He didn't add new wood. He simply closed the flue damper to prevent draft and let the system prove itself. By noon, 6 hours later, his thermometer read 58 degrees. By 6 p.m., 12 hours after the fire went out, it still read 51 degrees. The thermal mass of the inner cabin, combined with the insulating buffer zone, was maintaining livable temperatures without any active heating. Dutch Henry's cabin, by contrast, dropped from 28 degrees to 18 degrees in just 3 hours when his fire burned low. Without constant feeding, traditional cabins surrendered their heat almost immediately to the relentless cold outside. The wood consumption numbers told an even more dramatic story over the full course of the winter. From December through March, roughly 120 days, Lars estimated he burned approximately 2.5 cords of wood. Dutch Henry, maintaining a barely tolerable temperature in his larger single-wall cabin, burned an estimated 7.5 cords over the same period. That difference, 5 cords of wood, represented roughly 50 to 60 full days of cutting, splitting, and stacking labor. In frontier economics, where time was life and every hour counted, Lars had effectively bought himself 2 months of extra time to work on other aspects of survival: hunting, trapping, equipment repair, preparing for spring planting. James Woolworth, the sawmill man who had so confidently dismissed Lars's design as ignorant, did the calculations himself. For a family spending 5 months in winter conditions, the double cabin design would save approximately 1,500 to 2,000 hours of firewood labor over a typical Montana winter, while providing dramatically better comfort and safety. It's not just warmer, Woolworth admitted to a group at the general store in late January. It's survivable. In a traditional cabin, if you get sick or injured and can't keep the fire going, you're dead in 12 hours when it gets this cold. In his cabin, you'd have maybe 2 or 3 days to recover or get help. That gap could mean everything. By late January, as the cold snap finally broke and temperatures climbed back toward zero, Lars Eriksson's stupid cabin inside a cabin had become the talk of western Montana. The Norwegian who couldn't count logs had, in fact, counted them perfectly, and he'd built something that would outlast the mockery by more than a century. The transformation that occurred in the Bitterroot Valley over the following 2 years was nothing short of remarkable. What began as mockery ended in wholesale adoption, a testament to the undeniable power of empirical evidence over conventional wisdom. By late February 1890, as winter began its slow retreat, Thomas Bradley approached Lars with a proposition. Bradley wanted to build a double-wall addition to his existing cabin, using Lars's principles. He'd spent the winter doing calculations, and the numbers haunted him. He'd burned nearly 8 cords of wood to Lars's 2.5, spending roughly 65 days of labor on firewood procurement alone. That was 65 days he could have spent on other work, 65 days of his finite life consumed by the inefficiency of traditional construction. "I'm not too proud to admit when I'm wrong," Bradley told Lars in early March. "Your design works. I want to understand it fully." Lars spent 3 days at Bradley's property, sketching plans, explaining the critical details: the 8-foot buffer zone, the airtight inner envelope, the intentional gaps in the outer walls for moisture control, the double roof system. Bradley took notes like a student, his earlier certainty replaced by genuine curiosity. By autumn 1890, Bradley had completed his retrofit, not a full double cabin like Lars's, but a hybrid system that added a 4-foot buffer zone to the north and west walls of his existing structure, where the prevailing winter winds hit hardest. The results that winter, while not as dramatic as Lars's full system, were still impressive. Bradley estimated he saved 40% on his wood consumption while maintaining interior temperatures 15 to 18 degrees warmer than the previous year. Dutch Henry went even further. In spring 1891, he tore down his existing cabin entirely and rebuilt using Lars's double-wall principle. His new structure featured a 16 by 18-foot inner cabin with a 6-foot buffer zone, slightly smaller gaps than Lars's design, but large enough to achieve significant insulation value. Dutch Henry's journal from the winter of 1891 to 92 recorded interior temperatures consistently in the low 60s, even during cold snaps, with wood consumption reduced by approximately 55% compared to his old cabin. James Woolworth, the sawmill owner, saw a business opportunity. By 1892, His mill was advertising Norwegian-style double-wall cabin packages with pre-cut logs and detailed assembly instructions based on Lars's principles. Woolworth's marketing emphasized the labor savings. Cut your firewood time in half. Invest those hours in prosperity instead. The design spread beyond the immediate valley. Homesteaders traveling through Missoula heard the stories and carried them to new settlements. By 1895, variations of the double-wall cabin could be found scattered across western Montana, northern Idaho, and even parts of Wyoming. Some builders used 6-foot gaps, others used 10. Some incorporated the buffer zone on all 4 sides, others only on the north and west. But all of them traced their inspiration back to that stupid cabin inside a cabin that Lars Ericsson built in 1889. The technique reached its furthest extent in the harsh mining camps of northern Canada, where a prospector named William Henderson encountered a Montana homesteader who'd built a Lars-style cabin near Dawson City during the Klondike Gold Rush. Henderson documented the design in a letter to his brother in 1898. The Norwegian method, they call it. A man can survive winter here without burning himself into poverty. I've seen it work at 50 below. What Lars had brought to Montana wasn't actually Norwegian in origin. It was far older than that. The principle of using dead air space for thermal insulation had been discovered and rediscovered by cold climate cultures for thousands of years. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia used double-layered tents with air gaps. Siberian nomads built their shelters with similar principles. Even the Romans understood that trapped air could insulate, though they used it primarily in bathhouse walls. What Lars did was adapt this ancient wisdom to frontier American construction using materials and techniques available to any homesteader with access to timber. He didn't invent the principle. He translated it, made it practical, and proved it worked under the scrutiny of skeptical neighbors who had every reason to dismiss it. The modern world eventually caught up. By the 1970s, building scientists were rediscovering what Lars had demonstrated in 1889. That dead air space is one of the most effective insulators available. That thermal bridging through solid connections can devastate heating efficiency, and that small, tightly sealed living spaces require far less energy to maintain than large, poorly insulated ones. Today's super-insulated homes, passive houses, and energy-efficient designs all employ variations of Lars's principle. Modern wall systems with 2x6 or 2x8 studs create air cavities filled with insulation, essentially controlled dead air space. Double-pane windows trap air between glass layers. Radiant barriers in attics use air gaps to prevent heat transfer. The terminology has changed, the materials have evolved, but the physics remains identical to what that Norwegian homesteader understood 135 years ago. Lars Ericsson himself lived in his double cabin until his death in 1923 at age 69. He never built another structure. He didn't need to. His cabin, maintained and modified slightly over the decades, served him for 34 winters. After his death, the property changed hands several times, but the cabin stood until 1957, when the inner structure finally collapsed from age and neglect. The outer shell remained standing until the early 1970s, a monument to construction quality that exceeded its era. In 1985, the Montana Historical Society interviewed Martha Quinn's grandson, who had visited Lars's cabin as a child in 1920. His memories were fragmentary. He'd been only 7 years old, but one detail stood out. It was the middle of January, and I remember taking off my coat inside his house. That seemed magical to me. Everywhere else, you kept your coat on all winter. But in his house, you could walk around in shirt sleeves like it was autumn. The lesson of Lars Ericsson's cabin isn't just about insulation or thermal efficiency. It's about the persistent human tendency to dismiss traditional knowledge as primitive, to assume that because something is old it must be inferior to modern methods. The builders who mocked Lars weren't stupid or malicious. They were simply confident in their own experience and skeptical of approaches that contradicted conventional wisdom. But wisdom isn't always conventional. Sometimes it arrives speaking broken English, building something that looks wrong to everyone who sees it, waiting patiently for reality to prove what theory already knows. Lars burned 43 degrees warmer than his neighbors, not because he was smarter, but because he listened to knowledge that had been tested by centuries of Arctic survival. He didn't argue with his critics. He built, and he let the winter do the teaching. In the end, the cold doesn't care about your opinions, your expertise, or your confidence. It only cares about physics. And physics, as Lars Ericsson demonstrated with 240 logs and an 8-foot gap of wasted space, has been consistent for a very long time. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge and survival wisdom, smash that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into frontier engineering and forgotten techniques that actually worked. And drop a comment. I want to know, what's one piece of old-school wisdom you think we've wrongly dismissed? Let's talk about it. The neighbors laughed when Lars built his cabin inside a cabin. But by the time winter was over, they weren't laughing anymore. They were taking notes. Note, this script is educational and historical in nature. Modern construction should always follow current building codes and regulations. The principles discussed here are presented for historical understanding and appreciation of vernacular architecture, not as construction advice.